Hi there. Sooner or later, most landscape photographers seem to get to a point where they want to print their own pictures. But there's a bit of an issue with landscape photography, and that is that basically to capture and represent the detail in the average landscape image requires a fairly sizable printer. And basically A3 is about as small as you can go. So the standard domestic A4 printer is probably not going to be satisfactory for you if you're trying to print your own landscape photographs. The problem with an A3 printer, and we take that as the minimum size that is practical, it is still a fairly sizable beast. And what I've got here is an Epson photo printer. Now this is an A3 printer. It was the cheapest in their range when I bought it, and you can see here with a 12-inch ruler that this thing is pushing 2 foot wide, and front to back the actual carcass is about a foot, but if we pull out the trays, you can see that the printer needs a fair amount of desk real estate. So the first issue to consider if you're thinking about getting a printer is how much room it's going to take and if you've got somewhere to put it. The second issue with a printer to consider is the running costs. When you start using photo quality paper and producing high density prints, you will get through a lot of ink and it will work out expensive. To give you an idea of this particular printer uses Epson's Claria ink set. Now they've actually changed the makeup of the Claria ink set, so you've got to be a little bit careful. The latest version of this printer uses a slightly different version of the Claria ink set. But basically it's a 6 cartridge system, and each of those cartridges at Epson's price, and you can get them cheaper than this, each of those cartridges will cost you around £17. That cartridge, each of those cartridges will contain about 11 mils of ink, which isn't a lot. Looking around on the internet and based on personal experience, it would appear that for a high quality A3 print, allowing a little bit of room for borders and matting, will take about 5 mils of ink. So you can see with a total of about 66 mils of ink using 5 mils per picture, you're going to be pushed to get 20 A4 prints out of a set of ink cartridges that are going to cost you the best part of £100. So if you use the manufacturer's ink together with the manufacturer's paper, it is going to be expensive. It is probably going to work out somewhere between £5 and £8 per sheet for a print using the manufacturer's consumables. Now the standard advice is that for the best results you should use the manufacturer's consumables. If you go third party, unless you go for one of the high-end bespoke systems, the chances are that you are going to end up with an inferior product. So if you're thinking about producing prints to sell, first thing is you wouldn't use a basic model like this. You'd probably use a more advanced system, possibly using a more complex ink set, which conversely is going to cost you even more money. But to get the reproducible quality, you're probably going to need that sort of system. However, if you're looking for a system for home use, to print things to go on your own wall, to produce prints for friends, then a system like this can offer a sensible way forward, particularly if you do opt for third-party inks. Now, the problem with these cartridges is their capacity is very low, but there is a way around that, and that is what is known as a CISS, a continuous ink supply system. And basically what this consists of is 6 tanks, one for each of the inks, which act as reservoirs outside the body of the printer, a set of tubes that run from those reservoirs to a replacement set of ink delivery heads that sit in where the standard cartridges would sit. That way, as the printer uses ink, it is piped in from the external reservoir. How that works out is, instead of paying about £100 for 60 mils of ink, I recently bought a top-up for my CISS system, where I bought 100 mils for each of the reservoirs, i.e. 600 mils of ink, and it cost me about £32. That drops the ink component for printing an A3 sheet to around about 50p a sheet. Similarly then, if you go for the third-party paper, you're going from around £2 a sheet to around 30p a sheet. So there is a considerable saving. The point to recognise here is not all independent or third-party suppliers are the same. A bit like third-party lenses, there are going to be good ones, there are going to be bad ones. And I've been dealing with a company now for about 10 years, small company that specialises in photographic inks and print papers, third-party, based in the Midlands. And I have to say, I've not had any problems with their materials, and they work very well in my system, and it means that I can put out a print for less than £1 rather than £6 or £7, maybe £8 a print. So it does work very well. So those are some considerations. Even so, there's a significant investment. You're probably talking about, and the replacement for this printer would be around about £270, actually not much different to what I paid for it. But you could get a simple A4 printer for a fraction of that. But if you're trying to justify your costs, the thing to think about is, if you do a lot of document printing at home for other purposes outside of any photographic interests, if you're having to produce documents that contain colour as well as black and white, 3 or 4 ink cartridges could easily be used and will actually cover the ink supply system and the refill of inks. So you can actually subsidise your photographic paper with general document printing on the savings that you will make on ink cartridges. So it's not all bad. Now, the printer I've got here is an Epson, and really the only reason for that is that when I was at work, my workplace used Epson printers, so I was more familiar with them. So I make no particular claims for Epson to be better than Canon, Brother, or what other high-end printers are available. But the Epson works for me. It was available at the right price. And ironically, I bought this printer because my previous A4 printer, which I had an ink supply system packed up, and they stopped producing ink supply systems for A4 printers because predominantly people use them for photographic printing. So to get a home document printer with reasonable ink costs actually drove me towards getting an A3 printer, and the benefit of that is I've got an A3 photo printer as well. Now, I'm not going to talk about the issues of colour managed workflows. There's a lot of stuff out there on that. And assume that if you're going to do this seriously, you're going to profile your monitor, and you will need to get a profile for your printer. And the advantages of using a specialist supplier, as I have done, even though they supply third-party materials, they do still give me a printer profile, which will give me a decent first-pass representation. So I can get pretty close to what I see on the screen with the prints I get out of this printer. But what I would like to do is touch a little bit on the practicalities of using a printer day in, day out. Now, irrespective of the brand of inkjet printer you buy, if you don't use it regularly, the print heads will clog. And generally the advice is that you should aim to use that printer and exercise all of the colour heads every other day. If you don't, sooner or later the heads will block, and it's very easy to get complacent or get distracted, and I was distracted by other things, and I didn't use this printer for a while and the heads blocked. And it took me best part of a week on and off putting proprietary cleaning solutions through the head, running cleaning cycles before I got that system up and running such that all of the inks were delivered regularly. So one of the things that you need to do if you've got a printer like this is to make sure that you put ink through it on a regular basis. Now this doesn't have to involve using a vast amount of ink. Clearly if you're producing an A3 print to exercise your printer, then you're going to use a lot of ink, 4 or 5 mils. But you don't need to go that far. If you get a small piece of paper, then you can use much smaller amount of ink. The other thing is you don't need to use photo quality paper, so you can set your printer settings for plain paper, which again will mean you're using much less ink. And the way to make sure that you exercise all of the heads is to take a printer test file that you can download from any of the companies that will create bespoke printer profiles from you, and run a print of that through your printer. Now this is bigger than I would use. This is 15 by 6, I think, centimeters, and you could get away with half that just to run it through. The other thing is at the end of the time when you've actually put your material through, and certainly before you ever run a main print to get a photograph out of your printer, what you should do is just run a nozzle head check on your printer. I know the way it's done with Epson because I'm familiar with it. It's under the maintenance tab of the printer control panel. Canons are probably different, but I'm sure they all have a similar system. And what that does is it will print out a grid of colours from your print heads, and if you see gaps in that, it tells you that the heads need cleaning. If you're using your printer regularly, that shouldn't be a problem, but even so, it's worth putting a sheet of plain paper through and running a nozzle check just before you run off an full A3 print on photo quality paper, because it's much easier to pick up the problem before you run the print through, rather than halfway through finding one of your heads are blocked and all your colours are totally wrong. So hopefully that gives some idea of the practicalities. My personal view is that unless you're doing an awful lot of printing, it probably is better to go down the third-party route. Find a specialist supplier who deals with photo quality inks, and if you can go for an ink supply system, you will save considerable amount of money. You can refill individual cartridges yourself, but it's more tedious than using a larger reservoir. The other thing I should say is that these printers actually work out how much ink they're using, and they know how much their standard cartridge heads control, and they will tell you that the cartridge is empty. Clearly with a continuous ink flow system it isn't, but the printer doesn't know that. So the modern ink supply systems have a reset button that you need to push when the printer is telling you that the cartridges are empty. Press the button and it will reset them, and the printer will then think the reservoirs are full again. Again, it's worth checking the printer ink cartridge ink levels that are indicated on your print controller before you run a print, because you don't really want to be having to stop the print halfway through and press your reset button. I have done it on occasions, and generally you can't spot the join, but why take the chance? So from my personal experience, I find this system works very well. If I wanted to produce a gallery quality print, I would use a bespoke printer. But for domestic use, this works very well. And it also gives you a lot of opportunity to practice with printing, so that when you do eventually send a file to a bespoke printer, then you are going to make sure that you know exactly what you need to send, and you send them something completely reasonable. Now I'm not sure how well it's going to display. This is a print that I produced using this printer. This is of local stately home owned by the National Trust, and the colours are pretty good. They are not a perfect representation of what I see on the screen. I am using the colour profiles provided by the supplier for the ink paper combination, but the fact is that every printer will be different, and really if you're going to produce high quality prints you want to get a bespoke printer profile created, which basically means downloading one of those targets that I showed for keeping the heads clean, printing out a print of that, sending it off to the company who scan that print, compare the colours that your printer's put out with what it should have put out, and create a profile to correct for the difference. They cost about 15 quid, so that's not vastly expensive unless you want to run 3 or 4 different paper types, in which case it can mount up. So hopefully at the end of this I've given you some idea of the practical issues of using A3 printers, and hopefully by pointing out the economics of using them for general use I've not put you off the costs, although the size is something you really can't avoid. So if you go down this route, good luck and happy printing.